Okay, so we've broken down the question, which is, just for clarity, starting with the captain's speech, how far does Shakespeare present Macbeth as a violent character? Now, as I said earlier, you have full access to the extract. I'm just, in case there's any confusion, by captain's speech, you may also have seen it as sergeant's speech. It is that in some versions. But that section of it could take up to as much as 30% of our analysis. We've got a good chunk of time devoted to that. However, in order to get a decent mark overall, we are going to have to link across the text. So, in our introduction, as I've already suggested in the previous video, we could begin by just situating the extract and then breaking down the term violent, perhaps having a brief link into context, but mostly linking into the main body of our essay and trying to generate a little bit of discussion or debate. So, starting with the captain's speech. I think for this, the purpose of this, we could summarise quite easily. So I would begin perhaps with referencing one or two things. I might consider beginning by linking into the tragic hero. So I might begin by talking about Macbeth's hamartia, which, as we know, is ambition, but we could argue that ambition stems from his power and you know, his violent tendencies. I might link into, as we already mentioned, megalopsychia. So the fact actually that it is his prowess on the battlefield, his skill as a warrior, that sets him apart at the beginning of the story. Or I might just think of it in terms of his downfall. Those are some options. I could also link to the overall structure of the text. So, although I'm going to begin with beginning of the play, in my introduction I might want to bridge the gap. So I might want to start by referencing that Macbeth is ultimately infamous as a demonic butcher. So I might want to consider the overall shape of the story. I could even make the point that in the captain's speech we have a reference to MacDonald, and link that into the fact that over the course of the play, Macbeth goes full circle. He begins by putting down a rebellion and ends by being taken from the throne himself, or begins by thwarting a rebellion and ultimately becomes the rebel, becomes MacDonald. So those are options. Or also, I can make a brief link to context. So I could talk about the fact maybe that this is a society in which military strength is significant. I could perhaps reference honour also. I could maybe reference masculinity and the fact that strength and masculinity, even violence and masculinity, are almost presented as one and the same by some characters at some points in the text. So I can reference these points, and then I need to set up some kind of discussion. And in terms of Macbeth being presented as a violent character, we might want to reference that there are definitely violent elements to his character, but I might then want to consider some other significant themes and start to weigh those up slightly. So personally, if I were going to write this essay, I might make the distinction between violence as something that rules him. I might want to link it into ambition. i.e. what drives him. And I particularly want to look at fear. And probably quite a significant focus of my essay is going to be on the fact that although he might begin as a violent character, we do see a form of paralysis throughout the story, and whether he ends as a violent character in that sense is debatable. So, pay attention to context, pay attention to the overall focus of the narrative, think about where this extract falls, and then try to reference the key themes that you are going to discuss. I've then got to decide on 3, 4, 5 areas that I want to discuss over the course of the text, and you can think of it as a couple of key moments. One of those is going to be pretty simple because you are going to have to spend some time breaking down the extract, in this case the sergeant or captain's speech. So in terms of the question, to what extent does Shakespeare present Macbeth as a violent character? Well, I begin by making the point that at the beginning of the play, Macbeth is certainly presented as a violent character in Act 1. However, that this violence is not perceived as a negative. So that violence, yes, but that this is seen as a route to honour, glory, and it's seen as something valuable. I might also make the point that this is seen also as a masculine virtue in the beginning. So that'll be my overall point. I then need to, considering where I'm going to be getting my marks in my plan, at least in my mind, maybe not physically planning out, but I need to know what I'm drawing on. I have a couple of quotations ready. So if I look at the extract, some of the strong ones might be the simple repetition of brave Macbeth. I might link into context. I might remember some lines from Duncan. Valiant cousin, worthy gentleman, and link it into the fact that this is where he takes his pride from. But also, if I want to get some marks for AO2, I particularly might want to link into a few more specific points. I could get some AO2 marks just from talking about the structure. So I could get some marks just from mentioning the fact that he's in his ascendancy at this point. I could talk about maybe the contrast between Macbeth and Duncan at this point in the play. But it would be useful to remember a few small quotations along the lines of sparrows and eagles, or hares and lions. So the fact that we have a couple of similes at this point in the text describing the valour, the courage, the power of Macbeth. And not only does this emphasise the extent to his prowess, but also the animals that are chosen as points of comparison are quite regal. And then for paragraph 2, I might stick with this. So ideally I want to be linking in a sensible, logical way between points, and I might begin this one with a Janus Face sentence along the lines of, although Macbeth is presented as an honourable, masculine, powerful character, we do get a tiny bit of foreshadowing, even in Act 1, Scene 2. The more obvious points that foreshadow Macbeth's downfall will come perhaps in the next 2 or 3 scenes, particularly when he encounters the witches. But even at this point, I might want to zoom in on quotations like smoked with bloody execution or unseamed him from the knave to the chaps. And as part of that, to get my AA2 marks, I might want to think about the connotations of these terms, the brutality implied by unseamed, perhaps the subtle imagery connected to smoked that might put us in mind of hell. And then I can link from there. So I could link to context, I could link to contemporary beliefs in the supernatural, I could perhaps think about language and think about that reference to the supernatural and link back into fair is foul and foul is fair, and the fact that Macbeth's first words in the play when we do meet the character eerily echo those of the witches. And I could link on to other points, so I could think maybe about violence or other elements of the supernatural, and I don't know, perhaps link to the the dagger soliloquy from here. I've then got options. Now, if I had the whole breadth of the play, I might go to, for example, the imagery of Macbeth describing being so far waded in blood that to return is as tedious as to go over. I might think about how he's presented in the final act of the play when he decides to go out fighting. Considering where we are at this point in the year, and that we maybe are only on the first few sections, I'm going to focus instead just on the supernatural elements and where we see some changes in Macbeth's character. So I would perhaps focus in on, considering we want a bit of context here and perhaps a little bit of discussion, the weakness that we see in the character. So Macbeth kills the king, certainly, but I might reference the fact that he dares not look on the king. I might consider his reluctance to kill Duncan, the descriptions of his silver skin and golden blood, and the fact that he's here in double trust. And I might use all of this to link to Lady Macbeth, and the idea that actually, in comparison to his wife, Macbeth does not seem to be presented as a particularly violent character. I might even link from this to her impression of her husband, that he's too full of the milk of human kindness. And from there, again, to context. So from the metaphor to the idea of gender. And then from there, I could choose a few different places. I might, consider I've set up this discussion, want to zoom in on a couple of key moments where we see that debate and see that doubt brought to light. So, for instance, I could look at the dagger speech and how you can read the dagger as a representation of Macbeth's violent intentions or as a source of his fear. I might link to Banquo and the fact that he doesn't, at this point in the play, kill Banquo himself, but instead relies on paid assassins to do his work for him. And then, in turn, I might look at Banquo's ghost and the fear that besets him. Banquo's ghost also has an interesting line where Macbeth invites him to appear in any form other than the supernatural, effectively implying that he would be perfectly happy to fight Banquo in any way, as long as it's an honourable fight, but he's not prepared to see a ghost to deal with the supernatural. So, we've got a decent breakdown there. We've considered the overall trajectory of the play, the nuances of the characters and where this extract fits. We've broken down how two different ways of looking at this scene, made sure that we've found some concise quotations, linked to context, linked to literary devices in every paragraph. We've introduced an element of debate and thought about the moments in the text where he perhaps is not seen as violent, but instead is seen as cowardly, weak, or even honourable. And we've zoomed in on some turning points in the text where that debate is brought to light. And then all that's left is to summarise. There is no correct way to answer your conclusion, but what I would say is review. So perhaps summarise what you see as your strongest points. Macbeth might be interpreted as a violent character, or an honourable man who is forced to violence. That violence itself might be interpreted as a strength or a weakness, as a virtue or a sin. And then you just need to give your own decisive conclusion. Ultimately, owing to A, B, and C, we might interpret Macbeth as a something character. Personally, for this one, I would go along the lines of we might interpret Macbeth as a man who is violent, but also as someone who is complex and nuanced, and is perhaps defined more by his weakness, his susceptibility to his ambitions or the supernatural, than someone who is violent thoughtlessly, or who is actually especially bloodthirsty. So, an evil character, possibly, but not someone who necessarily should be defined by the label butcher.